Hello class. In these videos I'm going to teach you how to complete the results section for your final project. You should have already turned in and had approved your research proposal. You should have already completed your methods section. If you haven't done that, stop and go back. You won't be able to proceed. But assuming you have done so and are ready to proceed, I'm going to walk you through step by step exactly what I'm going to be looking for in your results section. I'm going to be providing an example using data from an assignment earlier in the class. I will not be using the actual data the from the final project that you'll be working with, but the process will be exactly the same. Okay, so the results section is a new main section of your paper. So results is a level 1 heading, so it's centered and bolded. In terms of level 2 headings, you have descriptive statistics, which is the first part, checking assumptions, which is the second part, and then finally the multiple regression analysis, the third and final part of this section where you will be answering your research question. Beginning up with descriptive statistics, let's take a look. So first, figures were constructed in order to visually examine the relationship between each independent variable and the dependent variable. So we're going to create pictures of the relationship between these variables. So in your final project, you have two independent variables and one dependent variable. So you have to make two different figures, one for the first independent variable, one for the second one. So let's take a look at my data set, and I'm going to be working with the variables here, and in this example I'm going to predict prosocial behavior. These are a subscale from the strength and difficulties questionnaire using peer church support. So these are kids that go to church. This is a measure of the amount of support they're receiving from the peers in their church. Our theory is that the more support they're receiving from their peers, the more they're going to identify with the church and embrace the values of the church, including prosocial behavior. So sharing, being kind, being helpful, and so forth. We're going to control for sex. So sex and peer support are going to predict prosocial behavior in our model. Now you may notice here that I don't have any composite variables in the data set. So what often happens is students do the method section and they create the composite variables, they turn it in, everything's fine, and then they either don't save it or they otherwise lose that data set, so their composite variables aren't there anymore. That's problematic. We need those variables. So if you already have those saved, great. If you don't, you're going to have to recreate those again, but it's an easy process. So I'm going to do that now. So I purposely waited to do that with you here in the video to make that point. You will not, under any circumstances, use these original scores. So these are the answers to the individual questions, survey questions. So there's 4 survey questions here, 5 survey questions here. These will not show up in your results section. Okay, this is a very one of the most common errors, fatal errors that students will make. So if you try to run your analyses with these questions in your results section, yes in the methods, no in the results. If you turn that in, it will be rejected. All right, it won't even count. You need to use the composite score. So let's do that now. So let's go to Analyze Dimension Reduction Factor. So I already have the variables, the items for the dependent variable here. So this is the 5 strength and difficulties questions. I've checked to save as variables my composite scores. I'll click OK. The factor analysis runs. Again, one component. All of them are loading over 0.4. That should be fine. And I have the new score. I'm going to rename this prosocial, and I'll label it, I will not label it that, prosocial behavior. So it's important that you create the composite score. It's also important to give that a meaningful name. If you leave it as FAC1_1 and you create these the tables and the graphs and so forth, it will be very difficult to interpret for your reader. So we want to rename it, give it a meaningful name based on the variable that you're working with. All right? So I've created this variable. This is my dependent variable. I'll also need to create my other my independent variable. So here's my 4 peer support items. Bring those over. Again, I'm saving them as a variable. The factor analysis runs. Everything looks good. And then again, I get my new factor score. So I'll rename this peer support, and I'll label it peer church. Oops, does that sometimes. Peer church support. Okay, so this variable, and sex, these are the variables I'm actually going to be working with in my analysis. I won't be using these. I won't be using these. If it helps you to delete the ones you're not using, you can. That's up to you. Make sure you're using the correct scores, and these are the standardized composite scores. If you look in the variable view, right? These should be continuous variables now, ranging from on the lower side, ranging from probably around -3 to maybe around 3, depending on the variable that you are working with. The mean is 0, so the closer the score is to 0, the closer it is to average. So this is a student has an average level of prosocial behavior, not 0 prosocial behavior. Okay, same thing for peer support. This person, -2, -2 here is a very low level of peer support. They don't know the kids at church. They don't talk. They don't have a relationship with them. Over here, 1.3, it's on the higher side. The student probably has pretty good relationships with the kids at the church. Okay, all right, so let's move forward. So we're going to use a box plot to examine the relationship between sex and prosocial behavior. And why is that? Well, sex is a dichotomous categorical variable, so a scatter plot would not be appropriate. So we're going to go to Chart Builder, Box Plot, bring that up here. Okay, sex is going to go on the X because it's the predictor, and on the Y will be prosocial behavior, like this. Again, we will not use these original survey items. These should not show up anywhere in your results section. If they do, it's likely to be rejected. Okay, so sex, prosocial behavior. Anytime you're working with a categorical predictor, okay, so that's going to be sex, that will be religious preference, born again status, ethnicity. Any of those, you'll use a box plot to demonstrate the relationship between these variables. Okay, up comes our box plot, and here we go. So let's take a look at this. So sex is coded so that 0 is female, 1 is male. So we can see there is quite a difference between these two groups and their self-reported prosocial behavior. The median for females appears to be much higher than the median for males. There's much more variability within the males than there is between the females. And it appears that the females, on average, have more prosocial behavior than the males. So we're going to go ahead and copy this over into our Word document. Okay, we'll put that here. And wrap text square. That lets me get everything lined up just how I want it. And you know what? We need to finish this sentence. So between sex and prosocial behavior, because sex is a categorical predictor. Okay? So whenever you have a categorical predictor, sex, ethnicity, religion, born again status, things like that, that's going to go, you'll use a box plot with that on the X and your outcome on the Y. Okay, what about the other figure? Well, we're going to use a scatter plot to examine the relationship between peer church support and prosocial behavior, because peer church support, is this not working? Oh, there we go. Because peer church support is a continuous predictor. Okay, so let's do that. So graphs, chart builder, scatter plot. Bring that up here. No longer are we using sex. Prosocial behavior stays on the Y. It is the dependent variable, but we're looking at a different independent variable. And up comes our scatter plot. So I'm going to copy this and bring it over here. Okay. So make that a little bit smaller. Wrap text square. We'll try to line these up a little bit so they look good. Okay. So I don't want you to take too much time just focusing on how the figures are lined up. We do want it to look professional. We want it to look nice. So let's see what we have here. A visual inspection of the box plot reveals that. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. The median prosocial behavior of girls appears to be much higher than the median prosocial behavior of boys. There is more variability within the boys' scores than within the girls' scores. Some boys scored relatively low, while all of the girls scored relatively high. And there should be an apostrophe, plural possessive right there. Okay, so that tells us that there appears to be a gender difference. Now I'll take a look over here at the scatter plot. And what do we see? So if we look back at the bigger one, There looks like there appears to be kind of a positive relationship here. So when we go low on the peer support, we tend to be lower on the prosocial behavior. Higher on the peer support, we tend to be higher on prosocial behavior. We do have some low on peer support who are also high on prosocial behavior. So they're kind of bucking the trend, but there could be something else going on here. Maybe these are girls. Maybe there's the girls are socialized outside of a religious context to be higher in prosocial behavior, but within the church context, even the boys also are socialized more to that extent. So let's say something about that. So there appears to be a slight positive relationship between peer church support and prosocial behavior. As peer church support goes up, so does prosocial behavior. However, some children scored low on peer church support while still reporting higher levels of prosocial behavior. So what's going on here is there's more to the story, right? This one variable is not predicting all of the variation. Other variables are playing a role as well, and that's part of the reason we use a multiple regression analysis. So we'll be able to control for gender. That's as far as we're going in this model. In a more sophisticated model, you would be able to control for other variables as well and try to explain as much of that variance as possible. Okay, let's move on. Next, a correlation test was conducted to examine the relationships between each independent variable and the dependent variable. So let's take a look at that. To do that, we have to analyze, correlate, bivariate. Okay, so let's put our dependent variable first, prosocial behavior, and then let's include our two independent variables, sex and peer church support. Now, a big note of caution. If your categorical predictor, which you're required to have for this assignment, has two levels, it's dichotomous. That's sex, born again status, variable like that. There's only two groups. You can run a correlation. You can run a correlation, and the correlation will be meaningful when it comes out in the table. If the categorical variable has more than two levels, that's ethnicity or religion, do not include it in your correlation table, at least in that form. You could include it. The dummy variables, if you wanted to, are presented in some other way, but you cannot include it in this correlation table. The coefficient will be meaningless. So if you used ethnicity or religion, do not include it. If you use sex or born again status, do include it in your correlation table. So go ahead and run that. Up comes our correlation table, and we'll copy this into our result section. We need to interpret these coefficients. So we can say there was a significant, moderate, negative correlation between sex and prosocial behavior. I'm going to put this in APA format. Let's move that table down a little bit there. So R for correlation coefficient, in parentheses the degrees of freedom, which is n minus 2. N is 40, and minus 2 is 38. We'll round to the hundreds place, negative 0.49, and P is less than 0.01 in this instance. So not less is 0.001 because it is 0.001. Okay. There was also a significant, moderate, positive, we have to get this in the way, correlation between peer church support and prosocial behavior. And again, we'll put it in APA format. R, degrees of freedom is 38, equals correlation coefficient is 0.42, and in this case, P is less than 0.01. We also need to address the possible issue of collinearity. Collinearity occurs when the two independent variables are highly correlated, let's say 0.8 or above, which will cause our regression coefficients to become unstable. So our two independent variables, peer church support and sex, in this case are not significantly correlated. The p-value is 0.52, so there is no issue with collinearity. So we can say the two independent variables are not significantly correlated. Thus, collinearity is not an issue in this model. All right, we'll stop the video here and we'll pick up, we'll review this quickly and we'll pick up with checking assumptions.